So there we are. But I hope this will be some kind of substitute. I do mention slaves at some point towards the end, so watch out for that. Anyone who's coming here for the MAJ. Okay. Late medieval Bristol, as I'm sure many of us know, was the biggest port on England's west coast in the 14th, 15th centuries, and its second most important port in the country. Only London was more important than Bristol as a port in later medieval England. Bristol had a diverse economy, but its overseas trade was a mainstay of that economy. It was the real kind of core of what Bristol did. And this overseas trade was based to a large extent on the export of wool, and then later on, particularly into the 15th century, of cloth, and the importation of a wide range of commodities, the most valuable of which being wine, dyestuffs like woad, oil, and iron from Gascony in southern France and from Spain and Portugal. And it's Bristol's trade with southwest France and with the Iberian Peninsula that I'm going to talk about this evening. So this is Bristol in the late 17th century, as many of you know. It hasn't changed massively in the interim, and this is the earliest detailed map that we have of Bristol. So I think this will, I hope, serve as an image of Bristol in what I'm calling the long 15th century, so from, let's say, 1370 through to the 1520s. Here's another view of Bristol. This is from Robert Rickart's Mayor of Bristol's calendar from 1478-79. I think I'm right in saying the earliest image of an English town. You'd be hard-pressed to find your way around Bristol using this, but it's a very fine image. Bristol's seafaring nature, the strong links between Bristol and the sea, of course, are reflected in Bristol's coat of arms. And here, on your right, we have the modern coat of arms. On your left, a medieval coat of arms, still showing the castle and the ship, just to reinforce the importance of the sea. And Bristolians were among those medieval Europeans on the extreme western seaboard of their subcontinent. Like the inhabitants of the west coast of Ireland or the Portuguese, when Bristolians looked out to sea, they were looking out from the edge of the known world until Columbus and Cabot and so on. That was it. You know, it was terra incognita, apart from a few islands, one of which I'll mention in a moment. So I think, I hope I could be allowed for using this description, looking out from the edge of the world, because in a sense, that's what they were doing. And this is a map taken from Carus Wilson's classic study of Bristol's overseas trade in the Middle Ages. I owe anybody who works on Bristol and medieval trade owes an enormous debt of gratitude to the work of Carus Wilson, so it's a great pleasure to be able to acknowledge that. Here, this is a map showing Bristol's trade routes. I'm going to be talking about these ones, not those. I'm going to restrain myself from talking about the Icelanders, because people who know me may be sick of hearing me talk about Icelanders, and indeed I'm not going to talk about Ireland or the rest of the British Isles. And you'll see that it's that part of Europe that occupies a very large part of Bristol's trade in this period. And there's a foundation myth that reflects Bristol's strong links with the sea. And I just want to talk about that, because I think it reinforces how other Europeans thought about Bristol as being a port, a place intimately linked with the sea. This foundation myth concerns the Portuguese island of Madeira, or Madeira, as we say just up here. According to a story, whose earliest witness occurs in 16th century Iberian manuscripts in Spain and Portugal. The island was accidentally discovered in the reign of Edward III, so between 1327 and 1377, by a pair of English lovers, Robert Machin, a knight, and Anna Anne de Arfet, a noblewoman. They were shipwrecked on Madeira after fleeing from an attempt to marry Anne off to what was deemed a more suitable partner. And this more suitable partner is described in the earliest version of the story as Un Noble de Bristol. And the story is quite, in all of its versions, is quite clear that these two begin in Bristol. And they flee Bristol in a French ship, with the idea being that the French ship would take them to France, which at the time was at war with England, and therefore they could escape from this attempt to marry Anne off to a partner deemed more suitable by her parents. En route, and this is largely for Jeanette actually, en route they were involved in a storm, they were blown off course. You'll see quite a considerable way off course. They probably had my ancestor navigating. And they made it to Madeira, where Anne died. Robert buried her and wrote a Latin inscription. And sometime later, some Portuguese sailors found the island, found the inscription, and reported this to Henry the Navigator in Portugal. And from that point on, in the early 15th century, the Portuguese began to colonize this island. But these stories are most emphatic that the island was first discovered by English, quite possibly by Bristolians. So, of course, it shouldn't be called Madeira or Madeira, but Madeira. Recognition of that fact. Whatever truth there might be in this story, I think the fact that it seemed entirely appropriate to its Portuguese and Spanish writers, listeners, that it was from Bristol that these people set out. And that, I think, gives us some indication of the reputation of Bristol and Bristolians as seafaring people among the Iberians and beyond. Beyond Britain and Ireland, Gascony and the Iberian Peninsula were Bristol's most important trading partners, although Iceland, of course, also figures significantly, as it does in my book. Well, my book's soon to be written, one day. Henry II's accession to the English throne in 1154 brought new territories and new commercial opportunities. He had married Eleanor of Aquitaine the year before, and so the Duchy of Aquitaine and the rich vineyards of Gascony became part of the possessions of the English crown. Gascony became a casus belli between the kings of England and France following Philip II's formal confiscation of John's French lands in 1204. I'm just giving you this history because there will be a test later, but it's very important to understand the kind of grand political narrative in terms of giving a context for the day-to-day lives of Bristol merchants and shippers. So, the French formally confiscated King John's French possessions. Normandy was actually taken back into French possession. Gascony wasn't. But it remained a bone of contention. The French continued to claim Gascony as their own until 1453, when, at the end of the 100 Years' War, Gascony was finally lost by the English to the French. England's links with the Iberian Peninsula... Oh, I was going to just say something about the slide. Wool and cloth, the great English exports to Gascony. Surprisingly, English wine wasn't in great demand in Gascony, so it was Gascon wine, dye stuffs like woad and so on, which which were imported in considerable quantity. And there were a few French residents in Bristol while I'm talking about France. Not many, and I'll talk more about this later on, but here are a few case studies of people who came from Gascony or from Brittany or from Normandy. Quite a few came over after the fall of Gascony in 1453 and the loss of Normandy a few years earlier. So in the mid-15th century, Bristol had a small population of French refugees, but it was always very, very small. England's links with the Iberian Peninsula had very deep roots. From 1154 until 1453, as I've said, England's concerns to secure Gascony made it very necessary, if at all possible, to have good relations with those Spanish kingdoms which abutted the southern boundary of Gascony. So, Castile, Aragon, Navarre became good relations with these places became an essential goal of English foreign policy. The growing power of Castile, however, was also courted by the French, and English diplomatic aims were rarely entirely successful in the later Middle Ages. In the words of Anthony Goodman, who's written on this subject, the main theme of Anglo-Iberian relations in the 13th century was the establishment of an alliance with Castile. Their main theme in the 14th and the first half of the 15th century was the failure to re-establish it. So France was always one step ahead of England in terms of courting Castile. And that caused England very serious problems. It raised serious fears about the security of Gascony, and it dragged Spain and Portugal into the 100 Years' War. Jumping ahead about 100 years, at the end of the 15th century, Henry VII pursued an aggressive mercantilist policy designed to expand English commerce by restricting opportunities for foreign merchants. This was protectionism with a medieval flavour. This resulted in the Navigation Acts of 1486 to 1489, which prohibited merchants from using foreign ships without a royal licence, unless English ships were unavailable, in which case they could use foreign ships. And it also resulted in the Treaty of Medina del Campo in 1489, which imposed much higher customs dues on Spanish merchants. When I was writing this, I had a nasty shiver down my back because it took me back to school and having to learn about these things for no good reason that I could discern at the time, but there we are. In 1494, the Spanish reciprocated with their own restrictions on English trade. So things were looking a bit bumpy under Henry VII until the very end of his reign. And early in the 16th century, diplomatic relations between England and the Catholic kings Ferdinand and Isabella grew closer and were marked most significantly, of course, by the marriage of Catalina, Catherine of Aragon, or de Trastamara, as she was more usually known to Spanish, Catherine of Aragon, to the sons of the first Tudor king, Henry VII. First of all, Prince Arthur, ill-fated match, and then famously to Henry VIII. Part of the diplomacy leading to the second marriage entailed the suspension on the restrictions on shipping. The failure of this marriage and the onset of England's break with Rome from 1529 provides the end point of this talk. And these are some of the commodities that Bristol dealt with Spain, and some of the major ports, Silves, Faro, Seville, Huelva, and Sanlúcar de Barrameda. So a mixture of ports in Andalusia in southern Spain, and also northeastern Spain, Bilbao, San Sebastián, and Santander, where the main commodity traded was iron, very, very important mineral mining industry in the Basque Country. And also something I'll talk about in a moment, pilgrims to Santiago de Compostela in northwest Spain. Yeah, let's do aliens in a moment. By contrast with medieval England's troubled diplomatic relations with Castile, those between England and Portugal have been generally harmonious since at least the 12th century. There have been bad patches, and a Portuguese friend informs me that a verse of the Portuguese national anthem, which is no longer sung, is all about going out and beating up the English, written after a nasty moment in the 1890s, but we'll pass over that. In 1147, an English contingent helped to seize Lisbon from its Muslim overlords, and several Englishmen remained in Portugal to found local dynasties, quite a few of them from the West Country. Anglo-Portuguese treaties of 1353, 1373 and 1386 gave formal acknowledgement and expression to close commercial and political links. The last of these, the Treaty of Windsor, came a year after English support had helped João of Avis win independence from Castile and the Portuguese crown, thereby founding the Avis dynasty, at the Battle of Aljubarrota. This was followed in 1387 by the marriage of the new king, João, to Philippa, daughter of John of Gaunt and stepsister to Constanza of Castile. So the English royal family were quite closely linked in this period to the Spanish and Portuguese royal families. From 1384, João's efforts to win support at the court of Richard II were led by an obscure escudero, an obscure Portuguese squire called Lourenço Martins. And if there are any Portuguese speakers or indeed Portuguese in the audience, I apologise for my pronunciation. If there aren't, then my pronunciation is absolutely perfect. João was trying to get diplomatic support from Richard II. He didn't get very far. The formal ambassador was this rather obscure Portuguese squire. In fact, he was greatly assisted by a Bristol cloth merchant, a man called Thomas Daniel, who had extensive business interests in Lisbon, who was effectively employed as a go-between in Anglo-Portuguese diplomacy in the 1380s. Anglo-Portuguese commercial activity reached a late medieval high point, indeed, in the 1380s, and then began to decline quite markedly. Those of us from UE have a very esteemed colleague who could tell us all about Anglo-Portuguese relations in a later period, but he doesn't seem to be here, so we won't have the benefit of that. Some other aliens in Bristol from these parts, by aliens of course I just mean people not born within the loyalty of the King of England. One particularly interesting person, Mark William, who was Mayor of Bristol, MP of Bristol in the early 15th century. William sounds like a Welsh name, but he had an alias of Spainol, which would seem to indicate that he was actually by origin Spanish. Being Spanish doesn't seem to have caused him problems in terms of rising up the hierarchy of Bristol, but the fact that he thought it a good idea to change his name might indicate that relations weren't entirely positive. Going into the 1520s, we have a couple of people. Angaretos Nogué, I'm not entirely sure where he comes from, possibly from Iberia. Francesco Borsa, he's actually neither Spanish nor Portuguese, but he's Italian. And I include him just to really point out the fact that Bristol doesn't trade with Italy much before the 1520s. Not directly, at any rate. And when Bristolians tried to force their way into the Mediterranean market, they were met with violence from Italian merchants. But once we get into the early 16th centuries, then you start to see the odd Italian merchant appearing in Bristol. But let's get back to the 15th century. From 1154 to 1453, Bristol merchants could buy and sell in Gascony with fellow subjects of the same king. Bordeaux was the major Gascon port. While the first evidence for the Bristol-Bordeaux trade dates only to the early 13th century, within 100 years of these first signs of commercial relations with Bordeaux, this link had become a major factor in the economy of both England and of Gascony, and absolutely crucial to Bristol's prosperity. So by the 14th century, we're seeing the Bristol-Bordeaux link as very important indeed. Indeed, over the course of the whole 14th and 15th centuries, about 10% of Bristol's total overseas trade was with Bordeaux. Ships left Bristol loaded with wool and, especially from the later 14th century onwards, cloth. Bristol broadcloth was in demand throughout Western Europe. In return, Bristol ships left Bordeaux with French wine and other products of southern Europe, again particularly woad from the great woad centre of Toulouse. The loss of Gascony had a serious short-term impact on Bristol's economy. It came in the middle of a long period of economic depression in England, and the third quarter of the 15th century, 1450 to 1475, was a very difficult period for Bristol. Charles VII of France, after the English loss of Gascony, Charles VII took punitive action against Bordeaux and prohibited trade with England. The figures from Bristol's customs accounts tell a clear story. Wine imports were down from a high point of 2,457 tonnes in 1444 to 1445 to a mere 274 tonnes in 1460-61, while broadcloth exports declined from 7,546 cloths in 1447 to 8 to a mere 1,214 in 1460 to 1. Then things changed. In 1461, the new French king, Louis XI, ameliorated conditions somewhat, and commerce with England was allowed under certain restrictions. Trade with Gascony now took place with a foreign and potentially hostile land. Licenses had to be bought for each voyage, and merchants faced increased dangers from piracy. One important long-term consequence of these new, more difficult conditions in France was the reorientation of Bristol's continental trade. Trade with Castile and Portugal became much more important, despite England's intermittently difficult diplomatic relations with Castile. So, Bristol's Spanish trade centred on the import of dried fruit, olive oil, and of course, wine. These products from the southwestern ports, as I said, Sivas, Faro, Seville, Huelva, Sanlúcar de Barrameda, and with iron from Bilbao, San Sebastian, etc. The Portuguese trade centred on Porto and Lisbon, and this too encompassed wine, oil, dried fruit, salt, dyestuffs, wax, and also, very importantly, cork. The importance of Bristol's Spanish trade in the later 15th century is illustrated by the customs accounts of 1485-1486. In that year, Spain took 54% of the port's total cloth exports and supplied 21% of wine imports. By 1512-13, Spain accounted for 77% of both cloth exports and wine imports. Unlike southern England's other large provincial port, Southampton, Bristol's overseas trade was operated by its own merchants. It did not have the equivalent of Southampton's community of Italian merchants, or London's Italian or Hanseatic merchant communities. Also, whereas most English ports, at least after 1477, conducted their trade with Spain indirectly via ports in the Netherlands, so that they're kind of triangle trade, exporting to Dutch ports and then those Dutch ports exporting to Spain. In contrast to this, Bristol exported directly to Spain and imported directly as well. The dominance of Bristol's own merchants in its Spanish trade can be demonstrated with reference to the data from the customs accounts of 1485-1486. In that year, English merchants, predominantly Bristolians, shipped 96% of Bristol's cloth exports to Spain and 95% of its imports of Spanish wine and 86% of all other commodities were handled by English, predominantly Bristol merchants. But while Bristol's merchants may have formed the largest proportion of those trading through the port, they did not need to use Bristol ships to do so. Some indication of the relative proportion of Bristol and foreign ships using the port can be gleaned from the customs accounts, which generally give the home port for each vessel carrying the merchandise liable for customs payments. This table summarises this data for a sample of customs returns from the period 1390 to 1480. And again, it's based on Carus Wilson's work. Now, the considerable variations between the four accounts should immediately alert us that we shouldn't put too much trust into any individual account. However, also, I've counted voyages, not individual vessels. That's because it's often impossible to know whether a vessel that turns up with the same name twice or more times is the same vessel or just two vessels with the same name. So rather than make those guesses, I'm counting voyages. And that's going to have an effect because, generally speaking, there would have been more voyages between Ireland and along the Welsh coast because there are shorter distances than between England and Spain, Portugal. So that distorts the figures. However, I think it's clear that Bristol ships made up the largest single component, about 36%, of the vessels using the port in the 90 years from 1390 to 1480. Ships from mainland Europe made up around 17% of vessels using the port of Bristol, according to these data, but for the reasons just given, this is probably an underestimate. Looking in more detail at the year 1479 to 80 as an example, the vast majority of Bristol's own ships sailed to and from Ireland. 10 sailed out to Ireland and 9 sailed in from Ireland. Iberia, however, made up the next most frequent trading port, with 3 Bristol ships sailing to Spain and 2 to Lisbon, while 2 made a trip from Spanish ports to Bristol and 3 from Lisbon to Bristol. Next came France, with 1 outward voyage and 5 inward voyages by Bristol ships. Finally, 2 Bristol ships left for Iceland, but I'm not talking about those. In total, 48 alien merchants shipped through Bristol in that year, of whom 18 were also ship's masters. In 1479-80, one Bristol ship had a foreign master, the John of Bristol, whose master was recorded as Martin de Lana of Spain. In that year, the John sailed once from Bordeaux to Bristol and twice from Bristol to Spain. In the Bordeaux voyage, Martin de Lana shipped his own cargo of iron alongside the cargoes of wine and iron shipped by Bristol merchants. In the first Spanish voyage, Martin de Lana's ship carried cloth owned by another Spaniard, Martin Erson, and a cargo of onions shipped by a Spanish factor and attorney of the English nobleman Henry Boucher, Earl of Essex. I'm tempted to write a paper on Henry Boucher's onion industry, because he's shipping onions in vast quantities all over the place. always through attorneys, because noblemen, of course, don't get their hands dirty with onions. But I won't. On these two Spanish voyages, Bristol merchants also shipped large cargoes of cloth. Now, the point of this story is that there's a great deal of interaction. You've got Bristolians, you've got Spanish, you've got French, all involved in this trade, all shipping in the same ships, sharing cargoes, and working with each other quite clearly. Iberian and French ships using Bristol regularly carried cargoes shipped by alien merchants, usually but not invariably from the country of origin of the ship. There are exceptions, such as Spanish merchants shipping in a French ship from Bristol. While some continental vessels embarked on voyages with cargoes entirely supplied by alien merchants, usually these ships carried mixed cargoes, with English and continental merchants shipping in them, or even carried only English merchants' cargoes. In addition, a few Bristol ships carried the cargoes of alien merchants alongside Bristolians' cargoes. So, a high level of communication and cooperation between these various nations. Which raises the question, in what languages would they have traded, worked together, dealt together? I think we're probably correct in imagining the average sailor or factor, agent, applying these routes, having a working kind of smattering of various languages, having enough to get by in those particular environments, Provençal French, Castilian, Basque, Portuguese, English, maybe even a bit of Latin. As we shall see, some Bristolians had much closer links with the Iberian Peninsula, and for them the Iberian languages would have been absolute second language. They would have been fluent in them. Now, the absence of any French ships from the customs accounts before the 1479-80 account can probably be explained by the fact that before 1453, few of the exports from Gascony were carried in Gascon ships, and that English merchants importing into Gascony could do so free of customs, so these things just wouldn't show up in the customs accounts. Naturally, the situation changed after the loss of Gascony in 1453. And here we can draw upon notarial records kept by public notaries, by clerks in Bordeaux for the period, well, they exist really for the period 1472 to 1520. And they show a marked decline in Bristol-owned shipping and a concomitant rise in French-owned ships. Over this 48-year period, only only 19 voyages from Bordeaux are recorded as taking place employing Bristol ships, giving an average of only one voyage every 2.5 years. By contrast, other ports on England's south coast are well represented. However, this does not mean that trade with Bristol was insignificant. Bristol featured as a destination in 38 recorded voyages, and at least 31 voyages carried cargoes shipped by Bristol merchants. So something's happening. It's not a calamitous decline in trade, but it's a very significant decline in using Bristol ships. And this decline of Bristol ships in the Bordeaux trade was part of a wider phenomenon. The Bristol customs accounts also indicate a long-term decline in Bristol-owned shipping between the two periods 1390, 1437 and 1461, 1480 across the board. And this is reflected in the Bristol-Iberia. I won't go through the figures, but basically take it from me that there's a decline in the number of Bristol ships. This is probably related to Henry VII's mercantilist navigation acts and the Treaty of Medina del Campo. So again, diplomatic relations are having a bearing on commerce. This decline was accompanied by the growing concentration of the trade in the hands of a small number of very substantial merchants, and their increasing use of factors and attorneys, of agents to do the hard work for them while they stayed back in Bristol. These factors could be apprentice merchants or fully fledged merchants who traded on others' behalf as a sideline to their own businesses. Operating as a factor, however, was not without its perils, operating as an agent for somebody else. While English merchants working in Gascony and Spain and their Spanish counterparts in England were evidently generally familiar with foreign legal processes and able to make use of them when necessary, we see these people turning up in the courts of law in both England and Iberia and France. Factors were liable to be left exposed if their employers reneged on their liabilities. And this is what the Bristol merchant Leonard Osborne found to his cost. In the early 1520s, Leonard Osborne was employed as his factor in Bordeaux by another Bristol merchant, Jerome Green. According to Osborne's testimony in the Chancery Court, in England's Chancery Court, Green borrowed £20 from Osborne, from his factor, from his agent, and promised to send a ship to bring him home from Bordeaux to England, to Bristol, at which time he promised he would also repay his debt. But Osborne was left waiting over 2 years in Bordeaux without any sign of either the money or the ship. During this time, he was imprisoned along with the factor of another Bristol merchant. Osborne stood surety for the payment of both men's ransoms, and the other factor was released so he could return to England to raise the ransom to release both of them from this obligation. He did not return either. So Osborne, stuck in Bordeaux, stuck in prison, had to persuade a London merchant, Thomas Gittins, to pay his ransom, with the promise of payment once Osborne returned to England. However, according to Osborne's plea, on returning to England, he was imprisoned in London for non-payment of debt. So a slight improvement, he'd gone from a prison in Bordeaux to a prison in London. There we are. And all, if you believe his testimony, with him as the innocent party. As this case suggests, factors could be involved in complex business relations. In 1505, the Bristolian Thomas Pinson, factor to John Collas, another Bristol merchant, delivered to another Bristol merchant, John Mason, at Bordeaux, an account book and other documents that had belonged to Anthony Holder, a former factor of Collas, who had died, and he requested Mason to recover certain other books that Holder had left at Fuenterrabía. So here we've got a situation where we've got documents spread between Bordeaux and Fuenterrabía, just on the Spanish side of the border. And a number of different factors all working together to try to recover the situation. In the words of Jacques Bernard, who's written the definitive study on Bordeaux shipping in this period, the commercial representation here forms a chain of many links, which I think has been understated. From at least the 1480s, some Bristol merchants settled in Andalusian ports as residents. Among the Bristolians in Seville were Peter Bordin, Thomas Maillard, and Robert Thorne. Thomas Howell, another member of this circle, probably also had Bristol origins. Particularly important as a base for foreign merchants was Sanlúcar de Barrameda, which you can just see. Oh dear, you can't really see it, but there's Seville. It's close to Seville. The lords of Sanlúcar de Barrameda were the Dukes of Medina Sidonia, the Guzmans, and they offered very attractive trading privileges to foreign merchants. Another Bristol merchant who lived here was John Day, famous for his cabot links. Some of these merchants were very well integrated into the economy and society of their adopted homes and had Spanish wives or mistresses whose children were baptised locally. Maillard and Thorne were actively engaged in Seville's trade with the colonies in the New World. Both shared leases with Spanish and Italian businessmen of the Reales Almonas, the royal soap factory at Triana, in the same part of Spain. They did this in the 1520s, and both owned slaves. The soap factories were worked by slaves. Thorn, Manuali had no problems at all about slave ownership in this period. The earliest documented English, in quotes, slave owner in Andalusia was from Bristol. He was the wealthy merchant William de la Font, who is recorded as holding slaves in the mid-1480s. I say English in inverted commas because actually he wasn't English. He was among those Gascon refugees from the fall of Lancaster in France in the 1450s who settled in Bristol. He was quite a cosmopolitan figure, moving from Gascony to Bristol to Spain. One important commodity in Bristol's trade with Spain was pilgrims to Santiago de Compostela. In the 1390s, we have evidence that Bristol was a port of embarkation for pilgrims, even though Dover and Plymouth were supposed to be the only ports from which pilgrims could sail. So there was a kind of illicit pilgrim trade from Bristol. From 1416, travellers wishing to go abroad had to procure a licence from the Crown. So, from that year onwards, we have evidence from the licences procured by Bristol merchants to ship pilgrims to Santiago. And this gives an indication of the size of the port's pilgrim trade. In 1428, 5 licences were granted to Bristol ships to take a total of 460 pilgrims to Santiago. In 1434, 6 licences were granted to carry 330 pilgrims. A notable entrepreneur in the pilgrim trade was Robert Sturmey, a leading Bristol merchant and shipowner. In 1445, he was licensed to carry 200 pilgrims to Santiago in the cog in the ship St. Anne. In 1456, he was again licensed to take 60 pilgrims. However, these 2 voyages came either side of an enterprising and disastrous pilgrim voyage organised by Sturmey. The story was told 34 years later by William Worcester, a Bristol-born scholar and antiquarian, and I'm using Francis Neal's translation, an excellent edition of William Worcester's work here. Worcester writes, in the month of July, Robert Sturmey, merchant of the town of Bristol, began his voyage from the port of Bristol to Jerusalem with about 160 pilgrims, and sailing by Seville, going to the port of Jaffa and to Jerusalem. And on returning towards England by the island of Modon, he was caught unexpectedly off guard by a sudden tempest and strong wind springing up in the black and murky night on the 23rd day of December. His ship, called the Cog Anne, was driven aground on a rock, and 37 men and seamen were drowned, to the great sorrow of their friends at Bristol and of their wives. But a certain devout bishop of Modon in Greece caused the bodies of the 37 aforesaid dead men to be honourably buried, and he newly founded a holy chapel there to pray for their souls and those of all the faithful departed. Now this was a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, but note that it went via Seville, so again Sturmey is using those Spanish connections to go a little bit further with those results. There's also another pilgrim voyage that is recounted in a bit of detail from the 15th century. And this is the voyage of Marjorie Kemp in 1417. Marjorie Kemp was a female mystic who dictated her spiritual autobiography to a clerk, which has come down from us. She was from King's Lynn in East Anglia, came to Bristol, had the benefit of a benefactor, a man called Thomas Marshall, probably from Newcastle on the Line, who accompanied her on a ship that had sailed from Brittany to Bristol, and from Bristol he was preparing to sail to Galicia, Santiago. He paid the master of the ship for passage for both himself and for Marjorie. But Marjorie encountered resistance. There was an unnamed rich man of Bristol who would not let her get on board the ship because he held her to be no good woman. This, I think, was no reference to her sexual morality, but to the fact that there was a suspicion that she was a heretic, that she was a long-on. She was arrested by the agents of the Bishop of Worcester and interrogated by him, but according to her autobiography, she so impressed him with her spirituality that he gave her gold and his blessing and commanded his household to escort her on her way. However, her fellow pilgrims also got rather fed up with her. She was prone to bursting into tears at every single opportunity, and wailing generally. We're told that she had been told that if they had any storm, they would throw her into the sea. Well, they said it would be because of her, and they said the ship was the worse for her being on it. However, she survived. She got to Santiago de Compostela, spent some time there, and tells us absolutely nothing whatsoever about the place before. Finally, Bristol's links with Iberia embraced cultural influences as well. Bristol's St Mary Redcliffe is one of the finest parish churches in England, as we were told by Elizabeth I. Its outer north porch was built around 1320 and has a richly decorated polygonal arch that I think has no precedent in English architecture. There it is again, and again. Rather, that doesn't look like a terribly impressive comparison, but I'm coming to that. Rather, it shows the influence of Mudéjar style, the influence of Muslim style on Spanish architecture. And indeed, the general Iberian Spanish-Portuguese influence on St Mary's is, most architectural historians would say, unmistakable. In addition to the porch, St Mary's and one other Bristol church, now the cathedral, but before the Reformation, of course, the Church of St Augustine's Abbey, contain very unusual stellate tomb niches. Both St Mary's and St Augustine's were patronised by the Berkeley family of nearby Berkeley Castle. These stellate tomb niches are also found at Berkeley, and it's Berkeley tombs that they're made for. The niches could be dated to the first half of the 14th century, and they show similarities with details in the north porch of St Mary's. They may have been designed by the same architect. They too have parallels in Iberian art. Similar designs used in door frames, tomb niches. I don't have any photographs of a tomb niche, but there is a church in Portugal which has a tomb niche which is 15th century, which looks exactly like those in St Mary's and St Augustine. But I didn't get a picture when I was there. Damn. Now, the thing about these is that they belong to the so-called Manuali style of architecture. They all date from the late 15th, early 16th century. In other words, if there is a connection, and as far as I can tell, from what I've been able to glean from architectural studies in English, Spanish, Portuguese, there are no earlier precedents for this, no clear earlier precedents for this actually in Iberia. So the obvious precedent would seem to be the stellate tomb niches in Bristol. Going back to St Mary's, there are rather unimposing possible parallels. Luz de Tavira, Valladolid, the convent of San Pablo, again, similar kind of treatment of the arch, but much more compelling, I think, is the Colegio de San Gregorio in Valladolid, and particularly the Capellas Imperfeitas at Batalha in Portugal. Batalha is kind of like the Portuguese Battle Abbey, built to commemorate the great victory of the Portuguese. It's Imperfeitas is unfinished, it needs a roof. This is, you know, Portuguese, Spanish building practice, perhaps, I don't know, no, it's not fair, it's been left uncovered for a long time. But again, this part of the monastery only dates to the early 16th century, and there are strikingly close parallels with St Mary's. Let's just go back to St Mary's. You know, I think it sticks out a mile. Now, there are other instances of Spanish-Portuguese influence on English architecture in this period. One or two isolated instances of what appear to be English or French influence on Iberian church architecture. But nothing, I think, presents such a clear parallel as these. The probable link is the Berkeley family. At least the probable link for the influence of Iberian art forms on St Mary's and the stellate tomb niches. The most likely conduits were either Maurice Lord Berkeley, who died in 1281, or his son, Thomas Lord Berkeley, who died in 1321. Both had been royal councillors and close companions of Edward I, and Thomas had been on diplomatic missions at least to Gascony, possibly further afield. Edward I's marriage to Eleanor of Castile in 1254 had created a dynastic link with the Castilian court, and cultural influences followed. This is the Eleanor, as in the Eleanor crosses. The apparent influence of Bristol's St Mary's and St Augustine's churches on 15th and early 16th century Iberian architecture in turn suggests that these cultural influences weren't only one way over the course of the later Middle Ages. Okay, I think I'll stop there. What I've been trying to do is to suggest some ways in which the kind of bare economic facts, I'm sorry if I had lots of figures for you at the beginning, those bare economic facts can provide a framework for looking at social history, cultural history as well. And I think particularly, I wish I was an architectural historian. There may well be one in the house, in which case, if I'm completely wrong, I take it all back. But I think that these are very suggestive links and things that deserve greater study. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Pete. I thought compelling economic history, given a wonderful cultural twist. All economic history does need a cultural twist.
Oh, absolutely.
You gave it a wonderful one at the end there. Peter will take questions or points from the floor, of course. What I'd like you to do, because there's rather a lot of us, raise an arm, don't just start shouting. And I will choose you in turn. While you're thinking of something to ask, because I'm the chair, I'm allowed to ask the first question. It's one of those great tyrannies that we like to perpetuate. So I'm just going to ask you, Pete, about, you were talking about the multiculturalism of the sort of trading links, which was, fascinating in a place like Bristol, and about the, to some extent at least, the kind of bilingual assumptions anyway you make about the way that people could speak and converse. And do we know anything about the crews? What can we? Are they from all lands, regardless of ship and ownership, or?
Yes, we know virtually nothing about the crews.
I had a feeling.
We don't have crew lists. We don't know the names of the crews.
Right.
We can just make assumptions. I would imagine. I mean, if you look at, I could have gone on at great length about individual voyages. I just, because I'm fairly merciful. I just chose, one or two. But if you look at the voyages that these ships are making, they're going from Gascony to Castile to Portugal to Bristol, Ireland, and they'll be picking up crew at every port, dropping crew.
So you talked about the navigation. Yeah. The navigation elements permit the crewing of British ships or English ships with foreign crew or not?
Well,
later on it gets complicated.
they don't. I mean, I think this is when you see the start of regulation. But before that, as far as I'm aware, if there are restrictions, nobody talks about them, which suggests that they're not actually in effect. So I would imagine that these crews, well, yeah, I mean, certainly before these things start to get policed rather than temporary, I would imagine that these crews are fairly kind of international and therefore to some degree multilingual. But this is entirely guesswork.
Yeah.
Certainly, I mean, there may be other ports that have much better records of this sort of thing, but generally speaking, you know, people do not keep lists of crewmen.
But there's something very sort of fascinating somehow about the idea of a sort of multicultural, multinational, international world of the seafarer, which seems to know no country. They spend more time at sea than they do in their home.
Yeah, and I'm afraid that late medievalists have to kind of rely on influence from the kind of period that you worked in, when you got records. So you can,
well, that's argued about in my period.
But yeah.
Anyway, right, Alex first.
Just to follow up on that, really. I mean, well, for a start, just as an observation, it's interesting to note from what you're saying, the controversy this week or last week from Starkey talking about how we're basically all from a single white British monoculture is yet again actually subverted when you look at the detail and you realise. But just to follow up really on what Steve was asking, are there any records or any kind of indication of tension between all of this, you know, this kind of melange of different types of all of these aliens wandering around Bristol? You assume that there's going to be lots of fights and conflict. And
I mean, there are. Again, one problem with Bristol is that the records of the law courts, the local law courts, basically don't survive. So there's a whole level of kind of lawlessness or judicial activity that we don't have. The next level up is things like Chancery Court records and King's Bench and so on. But for other ports where we do have these records, then there's plenty of evidence for tension. And there's also, so basically, and there are riots. I mean, in London, famously or infamously, there are anti-alien riots in the 15th century, aimed at Italians, aimed at Hanseatics, which can get murderous, very murderous. In Bristol, there doesn't seem to be the evidence for that. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. It doesn't seem to be recorded. What you do have, in great number, are records, mainly from the Chancery Court, of piracy, smuggling, an indication of quite violent hostility between ships' crews, usually of different nationalities, usually when those two nations were at war, but not always. So, English and Cornish ships might be at loggerheads, or I mean, there's a kind of general assumption, I think, with some people that anyone who's a foreigner was sort of fair game at a certain point. So it didn't really matter what the diplomatic relationship was.
I don't think that's changed, has it?
Well, no, nothing much really changes. No.
Have you had much opportunity to look at Bristolians being a bit leery abroad at all?
What you mean in the 15th century rather than previous periods? Plenty of opportunity for the latter. Not really. I mean, what I'd love to do is for someone to pay me to go and live in Spain for a year.
We'll have a whip round.
I'm sure they'll put in, just to get rid of me. And there are people. There's been some very good work, and there continues to be some good work being done on English merchants in Iberia in the early Tudor period. I mean, Heather Daunton, as some of us know, is doing some excellent work on that. But this tends to be in the late 15th, early 16th centuries, and I think if anybody actually looked in the Spanish and Portuguese records, they would find plenty of instances of English merchants, getting into trouble, but also trading in land, getting married, the whole kind of range of human activity. Well, not the whole range, but certain aspects would be going on, would be recorded. But I don't think people have looked. So that'd be a nice research project for somebody.
Who's next? Yes.
I was intrigued that you referred to slightly tongue-in-cheek, I think, an illicit pilgrim trade in Bristol. There were two other ports, I forget where they were supposed to go from. Can you tell me a bit more about why you couldn't go on pilgrimage from anywhere?
It's basically because the government wants to keep tabs on who's... It's the same reasons today, who's entering and leaving the country. England is still involved in the 100 Years' War. So there's still a fear of French spies or whatever. But also, I think, another reason is that if you restrict it and license it, you can make money out of it. So that's, that's one consideration.
There's one here, yes.
A question not from a historian but from a linguist. You had a list of Gascon traders registered in Bristol, and you used the denisation role, and that's a word I've not heard before.
Right.
Denisation.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it's there anyway. It's right. Yeah, basically, if you were an alien, it was possible for a sum of money, if you were networked and were in the right place at the right time, to get letters of denisation. So basically, it's quite a subtle legal point, actually, that you didn't become English. So you weren't naturalised in the modern sense, but you were granted denizen status, which meant that you didn't have the restrictions, you didn't have the penalties that an alien trader would have, but you still weren't completely English. And records of denisation are found from this period onwards. Again, as with most things, these become much fuller as we go into the 16th century. But they're a useful source where they survive.
Yeah. Well, back.
Just a slight thing. Your shipping tonnage, excuse me, I wondered if by the early 16th century that the ships, certainly built by Spain, were considerably larger, heading towards the galleon type thing, so that you wouldn't have got so many voyages because you had greater capacity.
No, that's very true, and that's something that needs to be borne in mind. I've been very cavalier about talking about ships and talking about voyages, and of course a ship is not a ship. It can be many, many things, and we need to think about tonnages. Sometimes the records allow us to get a sense of what the tonnage of a particular ship is, and you're absolutely right that ships are getting bigger.
Yes.
And we do need to kind of factor into the calculation the fact that some nation ships are getting bigger than others. That, as you say, Spain tends to be leading the way. The Dutch later on are developing naval technology.
Going to the Americas as well.
Absolutely. The American trade, I'm finishing in the 1520s, so it's starting to pick up. It's starting to be a major factor, but we haven't yet got to the period when you're having these massive galleons. But as you say, we're getting there.
It's on the way.
So that does affect the figures a little bit, but I think the overall picture still stands. And as a kind of a thumbnail sketch of the situation, I'm fairly confident that that's a reasonably accurate picture. I think the trends are stark enough anyway that they're not going to be distorted by that factor.
Thank you.
I think.
Yes.
Sort of a related point, that one thing struck me is the very small number of voyages taking place, like 2030.
Yeah.
And the size of the ship, my only benchmark is something like the Matthew, which is somewhere not very far from here.
Yeah.
So the actual tonnages, I would have thought, were actually, in any sort of modern terms, absolutely tiny.
Yeah.
I don't know whether the value was probably relatively more.
Yeah.
But is that the correct view?
The Matthew, it's not a huge ship. Evan Jones needs to be here to tell us all about that. The Matthew is not a gargantuan huge ship in contemporary terms. There were bigger kind of cargo ships carrying larger tonnages. But you are right. I mean, the total amount of commerce that's going on by modern standards, it looks actually very small. But of course, we've got to scale that back in terms of the total population of England of 4 million, something like that. So that in terms of that as a component in the total economy, it's still quite significant. But yeah, I mean, these are still relatively speaking, small ships, relatively small numbers of voyages. We are having to rely on the customs accounts, and they may not necessarily count everything. Again, if Evan were here, he could tell us a lot more about that as well. But you know, assuming that there's a kind of steady level of smuggling going on, then we can use them as a sort of rough indicator, I think, of what's really happening.
But the point you make, I guess, is that we clearly wouldn't all have been sitting down every evening with a bottle of Spanish wine on the table, consuming it, and then going to get another one for the following day.
No,
so these things are a little rarer than
the majestic wine warehouse.
That's right. Go, Chris.
On that point, actually, can you tell us a bit more, Peter, about the type of dried fruit that was being imported and who was consuming it at this end?
I'll try. I'm not an expert on dried fruit, but I'm assuming it's things like raisins and so on, and this just be used as an ingredient in cookery. I'm still less of an expert on 15th century cooking, but I'm assuming it's that. I'm assuming it's sort of dried grapes. I think. Sorry. Yeah.
But is it for sort of general consumption among the populace or not?
I think these things, rather like wine, these would still be kind of high-end items. But you know, how far down the social scale they go, I simply don't know. But I don't think we should think about this stuff only being reserved for the absolute quality. You know, but they're still quite expensive.
Thank you.
This one here, and then Phil.
I don't think you mentioned fish. Is that being landed in Western Europe by Bristol fishermen as well as in Ireland and Iceland, or?
Yeah, I mean, let's not talk about Iceland. Yes, it is. Again, the Basques and the Bretons particularly are great fishers, but Bristol's fishing seems mainly, Ireland, Iceland, British coastal waters seem to be that North Atlantic area. That's where Bristol fishermen tend to operate. Spain is much more about, wine and cloth and those sorts of commodities.
I was interested in a couple of things, really. The route that you've been describing from Bristol to Iberian Peninsula is very treacherous.
Yeah.
Both the Bristol Channel is notoriously difficult to navigate. The Bay of Biscay is always blowing up storms. So I was just wondering how much is there a record of how many boats, ships, cargoes are lost, and also not just to that, but also that you mentioned you touched on piracy again. So how rife was that, and how much don't we know about what didn't get through?
Yeah, these are very good questions, which is another way of saying I can't answer them. I can't answer them in detail with figures. You'll maybe be delighted to hear. But yes, I mean, this is a big problem. One of the amazing things, I mean, given the difficulties in navigating the Bay of Biscay, I mean, even today, you have a choppy crossing very easily, is the readiness with which people were willing to take those risks. Clearly, the rewards or potential rewards were great enough for them to do that. But thinking about these English communities here in Andalusia, and also the factors in the northern, in the Castilian ports as well, the degree to which there is regular contact between them, and people are sort of travelling between Bristol and Sanlúcar, obviously not on a kind of monthly basis, but regularly, keeping up those contacts, running businesses on both sides of the Bay of Biscay. It's quite extraordinary, I think. The willingness to sustain risk, I think. Risks that perhaps we would regard as being untenable today. In terms of piracy, it comes and goes. Again, it depends partly on the diplomatic situation. It depends partly on the kind of security policies of the King of England. Whether or not there is anything approaching a navy, that varies depending on. I mean, beginning of the 15th century, England does have the nucleus of a working navy. That declines under Henry VI. Under Henry VI, so 1422 to 1461, piracy is a massive problem. This is a function of the general collapse of English authority in France as well. And then under Edward IV, so 1461 through to 83, things seem to get better, but we're always reliant on very imperfect records. So that impression is no more than an impression. But certainly piracy is an important part of life. And again, there are numerous chancery cases that I could have talked about of people being captured at sea, being ransomed, not raising the ransom or and so on. So this was a major factor of people's lives.
So just what was the knowledge of those, of the kind of chart? Were there any navigational charts? What was that exchange of knowledge that you kind of referred to? Was that mostly done through orally, through discussion and through trading?
Yeah.
Or are there accurate charts of the coastline or even the waters at this point?
There are, well, you start to find accurate charts of coastlines, but sailing in deep water sailing, I suspect it was done orally. I think, I mean, again, I'm not an expert on this, but in the Mediterranean, you're starting to get proper charts, you're starting to get portolans, and a sense that you could actually, buy a set of charts, and that would give you more or less the direction to go in. I'd rather get the feeling, and I'm sure there may be people who know more about this than I do, I'd rather get the feeling that in Northern Europe, it's more of a kind of oral culture about this, but clearly, they know how to get from A to B without too much trouble. Apart from when they get driven off to deal.
One from Mike, and then Jonathan.
Peter, what about competition from other ports? Is there evidence of that one? I assume.
Yeah.
I'm guessing Southampton or whatever.
Yeah, well, yes, there was. But in a way also there wasn't, because Southampton's trade, while Southampton was a major English port, Southampton locals actually had little part in that trade. It was mainly the Italians that dealt in the Southampton trade. And there was considerable competition in the Iberian trade and also in Gascony from Italians who might well be sailing out of Southampton, but they're not other English merchants. That's part of a much wider, Italian network of trade, which is, talk about the problems of navigating between England and Spain. They're even more remarkable in terms of their navigational abilities. You have competition from them. There's growing competition to English merchants, particularly from Basques in the late 15th century. So an awful lot of Castilian trade is coming to be in the hands of Basque sailors. I don't know why, but they just seem to be much better at it than anybody else. And there's an element to which Bristol ships, Bristol sailors are being kind of forced out of that particular market, although the southern Spanish market is holding up.
Jonathan.
You mentioned the drawbacks of the port books and the customs records, but if one goes forward to the 1540s, we have John Smythe's ledger, and I wondered whether you, or for that matter anybody else, has used that to pick out a more realistic picture of trading and more realistic values of trading.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that using Smythe's ledger would be a useful perspective on this, and it has been used in that way. I mean, Carlos Wilson, I think, you used it, I think, and other people since then. I think the problem is that by the 1540s, things have changed very considerably. For one thing, I wanted to stop. Well, basically when I started to get into deep water, if you'll pardon the pun, in terms of my own knowledge, but also I wanted to stop the Reformation, because the Reformation you know, it's not just a religious matter, is it? It's the whole kind of diplomatic world changes. And trading with Spain, for example, becomes a whole different matter when you've got a bunch of heretics in England trading with, you know, the Catholic Spanish, and you've got to start worrying about the Inquisition. You've got to start worrying about being imprisoned for being a heretic. So, you know, things like that. I think the kind of picture shifts a bit too much to be able to simply read off from Smythe. I know that's not what you're suggesting, but to simply read off from Smythe's ledger to what was happening, you know, 50 years previously, I think would be a bit dangerous. But you're absolutely right. It contains an awful lot of very rich comparative material, as indeed does Evan Jones and Susan Flavin's edition of the Bristol Customs, you know, the 16th century Bristol Customs. A great deal of material which is of value in looking at the earlier period.
You mentioned slaves. Where did they come from in those days?
Africa.
They were African?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There was a long tradition in southern Europe of using black African slaves. In Spain, Portugal, Italy, it was nothing new by the 15th century. And I think one of the interesting things about Bristol's, or Bristolians' exposure to this is this question of, did it, in a way, kind of soften up English opinion for what comes a little later, well, quite a bit later, but nonetheless, you know, we can see it coming down the line because we have hindsight. So this was a perfectly accepted institution in southern Europe, something that Bristolians are just buying into.
Okay, thank you.
If that was the last
Can I
contribution,
just ask another
there's one
rather
more
simple
back.
question? Santiago de Compostela, what was so special about it that all pilgrims went there?
Oh, right, okay.
I'm just showing my...
Yeah, right, St. James, the great saint, St. James the Moor Slayer. He's supposed to have appeared during a battle between Christians and Moors in Spain and just decimated the Moors. He was one of the great saints of the Reconquista, the reconquest, the so-called reconquest of Spain and Portugal by Christians. The story, the miracle story about St. James of Compostela is that St. James's tomb magically sailed from his burial place, I forget where, but I think somewhere in North Africa or the Middle East. This stone tomb magically, miraculously sailed up to Santiago and was found there. I think that's the story. It was miraculously discovered, wasn't it, in Compostela. You know, a church was built to mark the spot. And certainly for the later Middle Ages, this was one of the top pilgrimage destinations, as indeed it still is. So it's St. James is a big draw.
I'm going to take one more question. If people feel they need to get up and go, you know, do just filter away. It's not a sort of formal. You have to stay till the end. So people lock the door. But on the other hand, if Peter's willing to answer questions for longer, then we'll keep them at it. You know. But you know, do just filter in and out as you wish. And just let people go, and then. Thanks very much for coming, and do come again.
Thanks for your patience.
Right, question there.
Can I be non-PC, Steve?
Yes, you can.
Well, Brian Little in
breaking
his
the law.
History of Bristol says that the Bristolian merchants drove such a hard bargain that there was a saying, 2 Genoese equals 1 Jew, 2 Jews equal 1 Bristolian. Have you come across this? Because he doesn't give any reference to
No,
it at all.
I haven't come across this. It may be that it was a saying that originated with Brian Little. A possibility. I don't know. Does anyone else come across nice say. No, not PC. It's not nice if you're Jewish or Genoese, or indeed Bristolian. Not really. So that probably covers quite a few people here. Yeah, no, I don't agree. No, and I've not come across it but then looking at customs records and chancery proceedings, it's not the kind of thing that's going to be counted.
It must have been a contemporary account, surely.
I'd have thought so, yeah. But again, when things aren't referenced like that.
Any more? Yes?
Can I ask about... Oh, sorry.
No, that was you.
It was me.
Yeah.
Can I ask about the coinage they used? Were there set exchange rates? Or was it a free-for-all?
Yeah, yeah. Again, that's a very good question. There were set exchange rates. And part of the merchant's apprenticeship was to learn about all of this stuff. To learn about coinage, to learn about exchange rates, to learn, what one coin would buy you in a different port. And of course, the other thing that you needed was a good intelligence network, because you needed to know when these things change. You need to know when there's a change of regime. You need to know when a treaty is signed, when it's not signed. So these people, if you're going to operate effectively in these areas, you've got to keep abreast of the news. So that network of agents, of factors, they're not just there to do business deals. I think they're there to supply information back to people as well. And again, at the risk of making comparisons with entirely inappropriate periods, David Harris Sachs, which is a name that I utter with a great trepidation in this company, but when he's talking about the 17th century and Bristol's trade in the 17th century and talking about how, in a way, trade across the Atlantic with the Americas is easier than trade with Spain and France, because you're dealing with fellow subjects, you're dealing with people with the same language, you're dealing with people who have the same money, and you don't need this network of intelligence that you need to operate down here.
I was wondering if there might have been a token system, but you don't know upon.
Well, credit instruments were widely used, so you didn't have to cart, great sacks of money around. So credit, was even then it was a thing that kind of made the whole system work, and quite sophisticated means of doing that as well.
You're going to have a busy few years.
But in a later period, I know the late 18th and 19th centuries, and